33 steel giants stood motionless across the churned earth, each one a monument to shattered ambition. 65 tons of German engineering pride, the most formidable self-propelled guns ever conceived, reduced to nothing more than iron coffins scattered across the killing fields north of Kursk. Their tracks torn, their running wheels shattered, their hulls pierced by the very ground they had sought to conquer. The morning of July 5th, 1943, had dawned with such promise for these machines and the men who crewed them. Now, as evening shadows lengthened across the battlefield, they stood as silent testimony to a catastrophic miscalculation that would echo through the remainder of the war. This was the baptism of fire for Germany's newest wonder weapon, the Ferdinand, and it had become a funeral pyre. The German High Command had staked everything on Operation Citadel, their desperate gamble to seize back the initiative lost at Stalingrad. The Kursk salient, that great bulge in the Soviet lines, beckoned like a trap waiting to be sprung. If German forces could strike simultaneously from north and south, they would encircle hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops, deliver a crushing blow to Red Army morale, and perhaps, just perhaps, turn the tide of this increasingly desperate war. At the tip of this ambitious spear rode the 653rd Heavy Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with 45 of Dr. Ferdinand Porsche's latest creations. These weren't ordinary fighting vehicles. They were the embodiment of German technical superiority, the answer to every Soviet tank that rolled off the assembly lines, the key that would unlock the fortified Soviet defenses and clear the path to Kursk in just 72 hours. The Ferdinand was nothing less than spectacular on paper. Born from the chassis of Porsche's unsuccessful Tiger tank prototype, 91 of these hulls had been converted into something new, something terrifying. The conversion had been remarkably swift, completed in mere months between March and May of 1943, just in time for the summer offensive. The 653rd and 654th Battalions had been formed with 45 machines each, united under the 656th Heavy Tank Destroyer Regiment. By July 5th, 89 Ferdinands stood ready for battle, one machine having failed to arrive due to a broken transport platform. The statistics were intoxicating to German commanders who studied them. The 88mm main gun could penetrate any Soviet armor at distances exceeding 3 kilometers, far beyond the effective range of anything the Red Army could field. The frontal armor measured 200 millimeters thick, supplemented by an additional 100 millimeters in critical areas, making these machines virtually impervious to standard Soviet anti-tank weapons. 700 horsepower from twin Maybach engines, connected through Porsche's innovative gasoline-electric transmission, promised the mobility to exploit breakthroughs. Yet beneath this impressive catalog of capabilities lurked fatal flaws that would reveal themselves with devastating clarity. The Ferdinand's designers, working under Hitler's direct supervision and blessing, had created a vehicle optimized for a single mission: long-range tank destruction from prepared positions. Dr. Porsche's revolutionary electric drive system, while innovative, proved temperamental and maintenance-intensive in field conditions. The twin engines roared so loudly they could reportedly be heard 8 kilometers away, announcing the Ferdinand's presence to any enemy within hearing distance. More critically, the vehicle possessed no machine gun for close-in defense, no commander's cupola for all-around vision, and observation was limited to narrow viewing prisms that severely restricted situational awareness. The weight, initially calculated at 57 tons, had ballooned to 65 tons with the addition of extra armor, making recovery operations nearly impossible with standard German towing equipment. The 18-ton recovery tractors couldn't budge these steel behemoths, and retrieving a disabled Ferdinand from contested ground would require 3 or 4 tractors working in concert, an operation fraught with danger under fire. The 653rd Battalion had drawn a specific objective for the opening day of Citadel. Height 257.7, nicknamed Tank Hill by Soviet defenders. This elevated ground commanded the approaches to Maloarkhangelsk and Olkovatka, critical junctions on the road to Kursk. Seize this height, German planners reasoned, and the way would open for the armored spearheads to plunge deep into the Soviet rear. Defending this sector stood the 81st Rifle Division, a formation that had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. German commanders, studying their maps in the pre-dawn hours of July 5th, radiated confidence bordering on hubris. Their intelligence officers reported the Soviet forward positions appeared lightly held, with minimal activity observed along the first defensive belt. Reconnaissance patrols noted an absence of the usual bustling activity that characterized Soviet preparations. Everything suggested the Red Army had withdrawn its main strength deeper into the salient, perhaps fearing encirclement, perhaps unwilling to contest the initial German assault. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. What German intelligence failed to comprehend was the staggering scale of Soviet defensive preparation. While the Ferdinand crews conducted their final mechanical checks, while commanders pored over their attack plans, while the artillery prepared its preliminary bombardment, the Red Army waited in positions fortified over months of unrelenting labor. The Soviet command had transformed the Kursk salient into a fortress unlike anything seen before in modern warfare. And the invisible architects of Germany's coming disaster had already laid their deadly traps across every meter of ground the Ferdinands would need to cross to reach their objectives. Before we delve deeper into this remarkable story, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us continue bringing these crucial historical stories to light, stories that must never be forgotten. Now, let us return to the invisible fortress that would doom the Ferdinand battalions. While German tank commanders studied their assault plans and mechanics fine-tuned their powerful machines, an entirely different kind of preparation had been unfolding across the Kursk salient. For months, since April of 1943, the Red Army had been transforming this bulge in the Soviet lines into something unprecedented in military history. What the Germans saw through their reconnaissance binoculars, those seemingly quiet forward positions with minimal activity, was nothing but an elaborate deception. Behind that tranquil facade lay the most formidable defensive system ever constructed, a labyrinth of death stretching nearly 300 kilometers deep. Marshal Georgy Zhukov had studied the intelligence reports with meticulous care, and on April 8th, he had submitted his assessment to Stalin. The Germans would strike at Kursk, he predicted with uncanny accuracy. But rather than meet them with a premature offensive, the Red Army would prepare defensive positions so comprehensive, so deeply layered, that the German armored spearhead would shatter itself against them like waves against granite cliffs. The scale of Soviet engineering work defied comprehension. The Central Front alone had dug more than 5,000 kilometers of trenches and communication trenches, snaking across the landscape in crisscross patterns that allowed defenders to move laterally without exposure to enemy fire. The Voronezh Front to the south added another 4,200 kilometers to this underground maze. Together, these excavations would stretch from Moscow to London if laid end to end. 300,000 civilian volunteers joined soldiers and military engineers in this monumental effort, working day and night to turn the Kursk salient into an impregnable fortress. They constructed 686 bridges to maintain supply lines, laid nearly 2,000 kilometers of new roads to ensure mobility of reserves, and built thousands upon thousands of fortified positions. 8 defensive belts extended across the salient, each one a complete defensive system unto itself, each one capable of bleeding an attacking force white before it could reach the next line. But the true architects of German misery were the Soviet combat engineers who planned the mine warfare with scientific precision. Previous defensive operations had used 300 to 500 anti-tank mines per kilometer of front, a density considered adequate by 1941 standards. At Kursk, Soviet engineers abandoned such conservative thinking. On sectors where German attacks were anticipated, particularly along the approaches to height 257.7, where the 653rd Ferdinand Battalion would advance, mine density reached 1,500 anti-tank mines and 1,700 anti-personnel mines per kilometer of front. These weren't scattered randomly across the landscape. Soviet sappers laid them in 3 to 4 successive rows, creating belts of destruction that extended hundreds of meters in depth. They installed mines with non-removable fuses specifically designed to defeat German mine-clearing equipment. They created false passages that appeared clear but were actually seeded with pressure-activated devices triggered by the weight of heavy vehicles. Every square meter of earth became a potential grave for German armor. The genius of Soviet defensive planning lay not merely in the density of obstacles, but in their integration into a comprehensive system. Mine belts channeled attacking forces into predetermined kill zones where Soviet artillery had pre-registered every meter of ground. Anti-tank strongpoints dotted the landscape, each containing 4 to 6 anti-tank guns, anti-tank rifles, mortars, and mobile engineer detachments that could rapidly lay additional mines even as battles raged. The 13th Army, positioned directly in the path of the main German assault, had been massively reinforced with artillery from the reserve of the Supreme High Command. The 4th Artillery Corps alone brought 700 guns and mortars, plus 432 rocket artillery installations to the sector. This concentration created an artillery density of 91.6 tubes per kilometer of front, including nearly 24 anti-tank guns per kilometer. Such firepower could deliver devastating barrages on any concentration of German armor that managed to navigate through the mine belts. Soviet intelligence had not been idle while these preparations proceeded. Through multiple sources, including the Lucy spy ring in Switzerland and decrypted German communications shared by British intelligence, Soviet commanders possessed detailed knowledge of German intentions. They knew about the Ferdinands, those massive new tank destroyers that embodied German technological confidence. Agent reports, prisoner interrogations, and aerial reconnaissance pieced together a comprehensive picture of what was coming. The Red Army studied the Ferdinand specifications, identified its strengths and its critical vulnerabilities, and adjusted their defensive plans accordingly. Knowing these behemoths possessed no close defense weapons, Soviet infantry and combat engineer tactics emphasized close-range assault methods. The absence of commander cupolas meant Ferdinand crews would have severely restricted vision, making them vulnerable to troops approaching from angles outside their narrow observation slits. The deception measures employed to conceal the true strength of Soviet defenses were masterful. Ammunition dumps were camouflaged to blend seamlessly with surrounding terrain. Artillery positions remained silent during German reconnaissance flights, giving no hint of the massed firepower waiting to be unleashed. Command posts were hidden underground, with no vehicle traffic permitted nearby that might reveal their locations. Dummy airfields drew Luftwaffe attacks away from actual air bases where Soviet fighters stood ready. Radio silence was strictly enforced, except for carefully orchestrated false traffic designed to mislead German signals intelligence. Even the forward trenches were only lightly manned during daylight hours, with the bulk of forces sheltering in deep dugouts and bunkers constructed to withstand heavy artillery bombardment. To German observers peering through their optics, the Soviet positions appeared vulnerable, perhaps even abandoned in some sectors. This illusion would prove catastrophic. As the calendar turned to July and the Rasputitsa spring mud finally dried, both sides made their final preparations. German commanders felt the familiar confidence that had carried them to the gates of Moscow and the banks of the Volga. They had new weapons, better tanks, superior tactical doctrine refined through years of victorious campaigns. The Ferdinands represented the pinnacle of German engineering, machines that should have been invincible, but confidence had blinded them to a fundamental reality. The Red Army of 1943 bore little resemblance to the disorganized, poorly led forces they had routed in 1941. Bitter experience purchased with millions of casualties had been distilled into a ruthlessly efficient science of defensive warfare. Every lesson from 2 years of retreat and disaster had been absorbed, analyzed, and transformed into doctrine. The Soviet soldier digging trenches through the cold spring nights, the engineer carefully placing mines in mathematical patterns, the artillery officer calculating firing tables for every conceivable target. They were no longer the bewildered defenders of 1941. They were veterans of Stalingrad, hardened survivors who had learned to match German professionalism with Soviet determination and superior numbers. The trap stood ready, jaws open, waiting for its prey to march confidently forward into oblivion. The night of July 4th dissolved into the pre-dawn hours of the 5th with agonizing slowness. Ferdinand crews had snatched what sleep they could, knowing that sunrise would bring them into battle for the first time. Mechanics performed final checks on the temperamental electric drive systems, ensuring the twin Maybach engines were ready for the demands ahead. Ammunition handlers loaded the heavy 88mm shells into the fighting compartments, each projectile representing the promise of German technological superiority. Commanders gathered one last time to review their objectives, tracing routes on maps that showed Soviet positions marked with reassuring symbols suggesting only moderate resistance. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, thick with summer humidity and the tension of 900,000 men preparing to hurl themselves into the furnace of modern war. Then, at 2:20 in the morning, the earth erupted. Soviet artillery, forewarned by prisoner interrogations and intelligence reports that had pinpointed the exact hour of the German assault, unleashed a preemptive bombardment across the entire northern sector. Hundreds of guns, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers tore into German assembly areas, catching infantry and armor formations as they moved into their final attack positions. The barrage lasted 30 minutes, a furious tempest of high explosive and steel fragments that killed hundreds of German soldiers before they could even begin their advance. It was an ominous beginning, a clear signal that Soviet intelligence had penetrated deep into German operational planning. The surprise that German commanders had counted on evaporated in those explosive minutes, replaced by the grim realization that their enemy knew they were coming. The Germans responded with their own artillery preparation at 5 in the morning, an 80-minute bombardment that dwarfed the Soviet preemptive strike in sheer weight of fire. Thousands of shells hammered Soviet forward positions, raising immense columns of smoke and dust that blotted out the rising sun. The psychological effect was calculated to be devastating, to break the will of defenders before German infantry even reached their trenches. But the Soviet positions had been designed specifically to withstand such punishment. Deep dugouts protected infantry from all but direct hits. Command posts buried beneath layers of timber and earth remained operational. Artillery batteries sat silent in camouflaged positions kilometers behind the front lines, waiting for targets that mattered. When the German barrage finally lifted at 6:20, the Soviet defensive system remained largely intact, its teeth unbroken, ready to savage the attackers who would soon come within range. The 653rd Ferdinand Battalion received its orders to advance shortly after the artillery preparation ended. But the careful German plan immediately began to unravel. Ahead of the massive tank destroyers, combat engineers moved forward with mine detectors, probing the ground for the explosive devices that intelligence had warned them to expect. What they discovered exceeded their worst projections. The density of Soviet mining was unlike anything encountered in previous campaigns. Detectors wailed continuously as sensors passed over ground that seemed to be more explosive than Earth. The standard procedure called for engineers to mark cleared lanes with white tape, creating corridors through which the Ferdinands could advance safely. But Soviet artillery observers had anticipated exactly this tactic. And now Soviet guns began to methodically shell the engineers as they worked. Casualties mounted rapidly. Sappers fell to shrapnel and small arms fire from Soviet positions that had weathered the German bombardment. The timetable for the assault, already disrupted by the preemptive Soviet barrage, slipped further behind schedule with each passing minute. German commanders made a fateful decision. Rather than wait for full clearance of the mine belts, they would deploy their remotely controlled demolition vehicles to blast paths through the obstacles. 27 Goliath tracked mines rolled forward toward the Soviet lines at 6:30, each one carrying 75 kilograms of high explosive and controlled by 3 conductor cables that unspooled from drums mounted on their rear decks. These miniature machines represented German engineering ingenuity, designed to clear obstacles without risking human lives. Behind them came a dozen larger Borgward B-4 demolition carriers, more substantial vehicles capable of delivering heavier charges to fortified positions or mine concentrations. The theory was elegant. The remotely controlled vehicles would detonate within the mine belts, triggering Soviet explosives and opening corridors for the Ferdinands to exploit. Reality proved vastly different. Soviet infantrymen watched the strange small machines approaching with initial bewilderment that quickly transformed into understanding. Orders crackled across field telephone lines. Every weapon capable of engaging ground targets opened fire. Machine guns stitched the earth around the Goliaths. Mortars walked their fire across the advancing demolition carriers. Anti-tank rifles, normally reserved for armored vehicles, were turned on the Borgwards. The thin armor protecting these machines offered virtually no protection against the storm of fire that engulfed them. Cables were severed by shrapnel or small arms bullets, instantly converting expensive demolition vehicles into immobile obstacles. Goliaths with their electric motors found their battery charges depleted after only 5 to 8 minutes of operation. Dying in the middle of minefields they had been sent to clear. Several Borgwards reached Soviet mine belts and detonated, but the clearances they created were narrow and difficult to locate under fire. Then, fate intervened with devastating effect. A single Soviet artillery shell, fired from a battery positioned several kilometers behind the front lines, struck one Borgward sitting on the German start line. The vehicle erupted in a massive fireball that instantly ignited 2 adjacent carriers. 3 demolition vehicles worth tens of thousands of Reichsmarks vanished in a thunderous explosion that could be heard across the battlefield. A spectacular waste that left German engineers stunned and the Ferdinand battalions still waiting for paths through the minefields. By mid-morning, with their careful preparations in ruins and their timetable hopelessly compromised, the commanders of the 653rd Battalion made the decision that would seal their fate. The Ferdinands would advance without complete clearance of the mine belts, relying on their massive weight and thick armor to survive whatever explosives they might encounter. It was a gamble born of desperation and overconfidence, a belief that German engineering superiority would overcome Soviet defensive preparations. The engines roared to life, their distinctive sound carrying across kilometers of churned earth. 65 tons of steel and armament began rolling forward toward the Soviet positions and toward the invisible death that waited beneath the summer soil. The first Ferdinand entered the mine belt at approximately 6:45. Its 65 tons of armor and armament grinding forward across ground that Soviet engineers had transformed into a killing field. The detonation came seconds later, a thunderous blast that erupted beneath the right track assembly. The explosion severed the track, hurled road wheels into the air, and left the massive vehicle lurching to a halt with its nose tilted awkwardly into the crater created by the mine. Inside, the crew felt the shock waves slam through the hull, heard the screaming protest of tortured metal, and realized with sinking dread that their invincible machine had been stopped by a weapon they could neither see nor fight. Within minutes, 4 more Ferdinands had met identical fates. Their tracks shredded, their running gear destroyed, their ability to maneuver reduced to nothing. The advance that was supposed to reach height 257.7 by early afternoon had disintegrated into chaos before it had covered even 500 meters. The problem cascading through the 653rd Battalion was fundamental and insurmountable. The Borg Ward demolition carriers had failed to create clearly marked corridors through the minefields. Artillery fire and the thick summer grass had obliterated whatever traces the remote-controlled vehicles might have left in their wake. Ferdinand commanders, peering through their limited vision blocks, could not distinguish safe ground from mined terrain. The machines weighed so much that even mines designed for lighter vehicles proved devastating when triggered by 65-ton behemoths passing overhead. Each explosion immobilized not just a single vehicle, but created an obstacle that forced following Ferdinands to detour around it, pushing them into unmapped areas where more mines waited. The mathematical precision of Soviet mine laying meant that any deviation from cleared paths led directly into killing zones. By mid-morning, the battalion had lost all cohesion. Its neat attack formations dissolved into scattered clusters of immobilized machines, and those few vehicles still capable of movement, threading desperately between their stricken comrades. Hauptmann Spielmann, commander of 1st Company, could not bear to watch his battalion die from inside his Ferdinand. He dismounted to guide his driver through the minefield on foot, walking ahead with a mine probe, searching for the deadly devices buried just beneath the surface. It was an act of desperate courage that ended predictably. An anti-personnel mine detonated beneath his boot at approximately 10:30, the blast shattering his legs and throwing him bleeding onto the churned earth. Soviet snipers and machine gunners, observing from concealed positions hundreds of meters away, immediately opened fire on any German soldiers attempting to reach the wounded officer. Oberleutnant Helmut Ulbricht assumed command of what remained of the company. But by this point, command meant little more than trying to salvage whatever vehicles could still move. The carefully planned assault had degraded into a survival exercise, with Ferdinand crews desperately trying to extract their machines from the mine belts, while Soviet artillery methodically registered on each immobilized target. Soviet anti-tank guns added to the carnage, though their 76mm shells bounced harmlessly off the Ferdinand's massive frontal armor. The psychological effect, however, was profound. German crews, buttoned up inside their steel cocoons with severely restricted vision, heard the constant hammering of projectiles striking their hulls, saw the flash of near misses through their narrow vision blocks, and felt the percussion of Soviet artillery shells detonating close enough to rock their 65-ton vehicles. The absence of machine guns meant they could not suppress the anti-tank positions, systematically destroying their tracks and running gear. The lack of commander cupolas meant they could not effectively coordinate with accompanying infantry to eliminate threats. Each Ferdinand had become a blind, deaf giant, powerful but vulnerable, unable to defend itself against close-range attacks or to see dangers approaching from flanks and rear. Those crews whose machines remained mobile continued forward, driven by training and discipline, and the desperate hope that somehow they might break through to their objective. Those whose vehicles had been disabled by mines could only wait, exposed and stationary, while Soviet gunners systematically destroyed the components that might allow recovery. By noon, the tactical situation had deteriorated beyond salvage. Approximately 24 Ferdinands lay scattered across the killing ground, most with broken tracks, some with damaged road wheels and torsion bars that would require major repairs. A handful had been completely destroyed by repeated artillery hits or catastrophic mine detonations that had penetrated their belly armor. The few vehicles still capable of movement picked their way forward with agonizing slowness, advancing meters at a time, pausing frequently to allow engineers to probe the ground ahead. German infantry, supposed to accompany the Ferdinands and provide close protection, had been pinned down by the same artillery and machine gun fire that covered the minefields. Without infantry support, the surviving tank destroyers were desperately vulnerable to Soviet assault teams armed with magnetic mines, satchel charges, and flaming bottles of petroleum that could be lobbed onto engine decks from concealed positions. At 1700 hours, just before evening shadows began lengthening across the battlefield, the remnants of the 653rd Battalion finally reached height 257.7. 12 Ferdinands, from the original 45 that had begun the attack 11 hours earlier, occupied the objective that German planners had assumed would fall by early afternoon. These survivors were mechanically exhausted, their electric drives overheated from constant maneuvering, their ammunition stocks depleted, their crews traumatized by a day of continuous combat against an enemy that had proven far more capable than intelligence assessments had suggested. Behind them, scattered across 3 kilometers of devastated landscape, 33 of their sister vehicles stood immobilized or destroyed, monuments to the futility of hurling technology against properly prepared defenses. The 653rd Heavy Tank Destroyer Battalion had suffered 73% casualties in a single day. And the battle for Kursk had only just begun. Darkness brought no relief to the German commanders surveying the wreckage of their carefully planned offensive. As twilight deepened into night on July 5th, the true scope of the catastrophe became impossible to ignore. 33 Ferdinands sat motionless across the battlefield, 65-ton monuments to German hubris scattered like broken toys across the Soviet minefields. Each machine represented months of skilled labor, tons of scarce strategic materials, and the concentrated industrial capacity of a nation already straining under the demands of total war. Worse still, these vehicles had not been destroyed by enemy action that could be countered with new tactics or better weapons. They had been defeated by the ground itself, by explosives buried invisibly beneath summer grass, by an enemy who had transformed mathematics and engineering into instruments of destruction more effective than any gun. The question facing battalion headquarters was not whether to attempt recovery, but how. Standard German recovery doctrine called for the 18-ton WWII half-track tractor, a powerful vehicle capable of towing most disabled German armor back to repair facilities. But the Ferdinand's weight exceeded anything these tractors had been designed to handle. Engineers calculated that recovering a single Ferdinand would require 3, possibly 4 tractors working in concert, their combined towing capacity barely sufficient to drag the massive hull across level ground. The problem was further complicated by the fact that the disabled vehicles lay scattered across contested terrain, separated from German lines by the same minefields that had crippled them. Any recovery operation would need to traverse these killing grounds under Soviet observation, exposed to the artillery and small arms fire that had already inflicted such devastating casualties on German engineers attempting to clear paths during daylight hours. The first recovery attempt began at 2100 hours, organized with desperate urgency by officers who understood that every hour of delay meant another opportunity for Soviet forces to destroy or capture these irreplaceable machines. 4 SIDKF's WWII tractors moved forward in column, their engines straining as they towed the cables and chains necessary for heavy recovery work. Ahead of them walked combat engineers with mine probes and detectors, attempting to locate and mark a safe corridor through the defensive belt. The column targeted Ferdinand number 341, the closest disabled vehicle to German lines, a machine that had lost its right track to a mine explosion but otherwise remained intact. If recovery crews could reach it, attach towing cables, and extract it before Soviet interference, perhaps the operation might prove feasible. The alternative, abandoning 33 of Germany's most advanced fighting vehicles to enemy capture or destruction, was unthinkable. Soviet observation posts detected the movement within minutes. The distinctive sound of diesel engines carried across the still night air, alerting sentries who immediately reported activity in the German sector. Artillery officers consulted firing tables prepared during daylight reconnaissance, calculations that identified likely German recovery routes and pre-registered Soviet guns on probable approach corridors. At 21:40, the order came down from regimental headquarters: illuminate and engage. Magnesium flares burst overhead, transforming night into harsh artificial day and exposing the German recovery column in merciless detail. 4 tractors, perhaps 20 engineers scattered among them, all frozen in the sudden glare like actors caught unexpectedly on stage. Soviet artillery observers needed only seconds to confirm target locations and transmit coordinates. The barrage commenced immediately. Shells screaming down from batteries positioned 3 kilometers behind Soviet lines, explosions walking across the recovery route with methodical precision. One tractor took a direct hit to its fuel system, diesel spraying across the superheated engine block and igniting instantly. The vehicle transformed into a pillar of flame that silhouetted the entire column, turning the recovery operation into a shooting gallery for Soviet gunners. Crew members tumbled from the burning machine and sought shelter in shell craters, pinned down by follow-up artillery rounds that burst with clockwork regularity across the killing zone. The remaining tractors reversed frantically, abandoning their mission and retreating toward German lines under continuous fire. Engineers who had been marking the mine corridor scattered, some making it back safely, others disappearing into the darkness amid the chaos of explosions and flying shrapnel. By 22:35, German commanders acknowledged the bitter truth. Recovery under current conditions was impossible. Orders issued at midnight reflected the grim calculus of military necessity. Ferdinands that could not be recovered must be destroyed to prevent them falling intact into Soviet hands. Combat engineers received instructions to approach the disabled vehicles under cover of darkness. Plant demolition charges sufficient to wreck the sophisticated fire control systems and damage the 88mm guns beyond repair. Then withdraw before Soviet forces could interfere. The orders emphasized thoroughness. If German industry could not reclaim these machines, Soviet engineers would find nothing but scrap metal worth studying. But executing these destruction orders proved as difficult as recovery had been. The vehicles stood in areas completely dominated by Soviet observation and fire. Approaching them meant crossing the same mine belts that had immobilized them in the first place, navigating terrain swept by machine gun fire and illuminated periodically by Soviet flares. Multiple attempts throughout the night failed to reach more than a handful of the disabled Ferdinands. Most engineer teams, confronted with the impossibility of their mission, returned empty-handed rather than die attempting the impossible. The final attempt came at 23:40, a last desperate effort to reach Ferdinand number 341 before dawn made further operations suicidal. A single recovery tractor approached the disabled vehicle, guided by engineers who had spent hours plotting what they hoped was a safe route. The tractor made it to within 50 meters of its objective before striking a mine during the turn that would have positioned it for towing. The explosion tore away the vehicle's left track, leaving it immobilized directly beside the very machine it had been sent to rescue. The crew evacuated under mortar fire, abandoning their tractor to join the growing collection of German equipment scattered uselessly across the battlefield. At first light on July 6th, 33 Ferdinands remained where they had fallen, most with crews evacuated, but mechanical systems intact. Prize intelligence targets waiting for Soviet recovery teams to examine them at leisure. German confidence had collided with Soviet preparation, and the result was an unmitigated disaster from which the Wehrmacht would never fully recover. Midnight passed into the early hours of July 6th, and with the new day came the final accounting of catastrophe. The 653rd Heavy Tank Destroyer Battalion had effectively ceased to exist as a combat formation. Of the 45 Ferdinands that had begun the offensive with such confidence barely 12 hours earlier, only 12 remained operational. 33 stood immobilized across the battlefield, most with intact crews evacuated, but mechanical systems salvageable if only recovery had been possible. The remaining vehicles had accumulated various degrees of damage during their 11-hour ordeal, their electric drive systems overheated, their running gear worn, their crews exhausted beyond measure. German headquarters received reports throughout the night, each one confirming what commanders had refused to believe. The advance on height 257.7 had covered perhaps 2 kilometers instead of the planned 20. The battalion had suffered 73% casualties in a single day, the highest loss rate of any German armored formation in the entire war to that point. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge studied situation maps with mounting desperation. The elaborate arrows indicating planned breakthrough routes now seemed like cruel mockery. Operation Citadel, conceived as Germany's decisive offensive to regain strategic initiative on the Eastern Front, was collapsing before it could properly begin. The northern assault had penetrated barely 10 kilometers into Soviet defenses that extended 300 kilometers deep. The Ferdinands, those technological marvels upon which so much hope had been placed, had proven devastatingly vulnerable to the simplest of weapons. Buried explosives that cost pennies compared to the millions of Reichsmarks invested in each destroyed machine. More troubling still was the realization that if German intelligence had so catastrophically underestimated Soviet mine defenses, what other preparations might be waiting in the defensive belts beyond? The entire operational concept rested on breakthrough and exploitation. But there could be no exploitation when the breakthrough itself was impossible. Soviet command headquarters received their reports with satisfaction, tempered by caution. General Konstantin Rokossovsky forwarded his assessment to Stalin and the Stavka. The German offensive had been halted along the entire northern sector. The defensive system, constructed with such effort over preceding months, had functioned exactly as designed. Minefields had channeled enemy armor into killing zones. Artillery had maintained devastating accuracy throughout the day. Infantry had held their positions despite massive enemy pressure. Most importantly, Soviet reserves remained untouched, positioned and ready for the counteroffensive operations already being planned. The 33 disabled Ferdinands represented more than tactical victories. They were intelligence bonanzas. Soviet engineers would study these machines in detail, analyzing their construction, identifying vulnerabilities, developing countermeasures. Every technical secret would be extracted, every design flaw cataloged, every lesson learned and incorporated into future Soviet armored vehicle development. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Germany had committed the majority of its armored reserves to Citadel, and those reserves were now being systematically destroyed across the Kursk salient. The Wehrmacht had no capacity to replace these losses. German factories, already strained by Allied bombing and material shortages, could not match Soviet production rates. Each Ferdinand lost represented irreplaceable manufacturing capacity, strategic materials that would never be recovered, skilled labor diverted from other critical projects. The Red Army, by contrast, possessed essentially unlimited reserves of men and material. Soviet factories beyond the Urals churned out tanks, guns, and ammunition at rates that dwarfed German production. Losses at Kursk, however severe, could be replaced within weeks. The mathematics of attrition had turned decisively against Germany, and Kursk made that reality impossible to ignore. By dawn on July 6th, it had become clear to even the most optimistic German commanders that Operation Citadel would not achieve its objectives. The offensive would continue for several more days, grinding forward at horrific cost. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Hitler would eventually call off the operation on July 13th, citing the Allied invasion of Sicily as justification. But the truth was simpler. German forces had shattered themselves against Soviet defenses without accomplishing anything of strategic value. The initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Red Army. From Kursk forward, German forces would fight only defensive battles, trading space for time in a long retreat that would end in Berlin. The 33 Ferdinands scattered across the killing fields north of Kursk became symbols of this transformation, monuments to German overconfidence and Soviet determination. They stood as testimony to a fundamental truth that no amount of technological sophistication could overcome numerical superiority, better intelligence, and superior preparation. The Battle of Kursk marked the point of no return, the moment when Germany's defeat became not merely possible, but inevitable. And it all began with mines, mathematics, and the catastrophic failure of Germany's most advanced weapons on the very first day of their deployment.